Okay, let's get started. My name is Gokul Ramesh, and thanks for coming to this session. And I'm part of the solution architect team, mainly focused on customer advisory. And my key focus area is data management, Power BI, and integration. So I have my colleague here, Paul.
Hello, everyone. Oh, sorry. I thought this was a big room, so I better be loud. Good to see you all. Integration session, very excited. Best practice. We're going to have one best practice session today and another advanced deep dive at the end of the day. It's going to be a more advanced session at the end. I know it's last session of the day, but I highly encourage you guys to attend both. Obviously, you're here. Just make sure you go to the other one, too. We're going to do a lot more demos and deep dives there. So,
Thanks, Paul. So in terms of session, we'll talk about, we'll talk about some of the best practices that we have come up with based on our experience. And in terms of session, we'll go through integration technologies that we have with Dynamics 365 for operations. And it could be both technology within the app itself and outside app, so we'll cover both. And also we'll go through some of the scenarios and the common themes that we have seen, and also go through best practices. And as Paul mentioned, we have a follow-up session on this later this evening where we go through some advanced topics and we have certain demos lined up. So how many of you have seen these slides before? Okay, few of you. Okay, last year when we met this time, we had like around few handful TAP customers that who went through this process. At that point of time, our experience was with those set of users. But now it's been a year and we have like 100 plus customers in production, and we have a lot more number that are in the process of implementation. So our experience here is both the customers who are on production and in implementation, and in some instances pre-sales, right? So in terms of AIF compared to 2012, it's deprecated. We don't have that anymore, and we have replaced that with OData. So in terms of document services, that's gone. Now we have data entity. And in AX 2012, we had the metadata, SOAP-based metadata service and the query service. While technically it's gone, we have replaced it with the OData meta service and the query-based services that we have through REST-based protocol. And again, in AX 2012, we had a OData query service. This was read-only endpoint. And it was mainly used for Power BI and some Excel scenarios where you could create Power Pivot and a few other things. And in terms of SOAP-based services that you have, custom services that you had in 2012, so once you upgrade them, those will work fine, so we still have them. And we also have a JSON-based custom service, so this is again free of cost. Comes with the standard product. And as I said, with the D365 for operations, we have the new OData endpoint. So it has both the metadata service and the REST-based protocol like GET, POST. Okay, in terms of authentication, so in AX 2012, it was really simple. Everything was on-prem, but now we have moved to cloud, so our identity manager has changed. So the new identity manager on cloud is Azure AD. So if you take a typical scenario here, I'm a client. The client could be a web-based interaction, like if you would go to D365 for operations URL, or it could be from a mobile, or it could be any integrations that want to call into AX. Sorry, I'll get in trouble for this. So in terms of when I say operations, just one thing, I'm really talking about D365 for operations. So let's say I'm, for example, a procurement manager, and I want to connect to operations. So the very first step is when you hit the URL, and so operations will not know who you are, and operations will reroute this call to Azure AD. And Azure AD will be like, oh, this is Gokul. I know he works for Microsoft. So so it will send back a token, a SAML token. And for all the future calls, this SAML token is then sent back to AX with all, for example, if you're hitting a purchase order form or any form. And then operations will be like, oh, I know this token. This is from AAD. I trust it. And then you land with the with the purchase order screen, and then subsequent request will have the same token embedded within your client session. So the only difference here between if I'm trying to log in individually and let's say you have a recurring job or any integration. So previously, I think we changed it in August release. Before that, you had to send your user ID and password as credentials to AAD to authenticate. But now we can authenticate based on the client ID and the secret key. So when I'm integrating, I'm only using my secret key to authenticate against AAD. So initially we realized that exposing the password would be at a greater risk, because once you have the username and password, you get all the services that are available on Azure AD. But for specific integrations, you don't need access to all the applications on AAD. So you send a specific secret key for that particular application, and all you have access is to that particular application. And with operations, data entity is at the heart of any type of integrations. So on a very high level, we have ODatabase integration and the native DIXF or data management platform. So the only other exception here is if you have some unstructured data, then you wouldn't go through a data entity. And we will talk about that pattern in subsequent slides. And in terms of data entity, both OData call and data management call, even at the high level, even though at the high level they use data entity, beneath the hood, they follow different code path. So if you're doing a OData call, then it will call certain APIs on data entity. Like, for example, you have an init value, you have certain validations, post-load method. So these things will be executed. The only difference between DIXF and OData is, so in DIXF we have, you read the file, take the data to staging, and then once from staging, then you take it to the target, and while you take it to the target, you go through validations and run all the APIs on the entity. The OData is just skipping copy to or get to staging. That's the only step that is missing, but rest of the things are same, and all your APIs on entity will get executed. In terms of very high level, we usually see two kind of patterns when we really talk about integration. One is the real-time integration, then the other one is the asynchronous integration. So real-time integration could be any lookup. So for example, I'm in CRM, I have a product, but I want to get a price for that product, and the pricing for the product is maintained in operations, right? So that's a real-time call. You get the price based on item and dimensions and few other values, And the other scenario could be like you want tax to be calculated. So there's a real-time call, tax gets calculated, sent back to the line. And if you see in the standard product, we have used this pattern in certain places. Like, for example, Office add-in, right? So you access an entity, let's say a journal. You create a header line and you modify it. And if you already have a journal, open journal, you can get that in a spreadsheet, update it, and push it back. So this uses OData real time beneath the hood. And one other place we have used OData is around Power BI. And of course, our mobile apps are built on OData, and that's kind of the industry standards. Most of the mobile applications use OData. In terms of asynchronous pattern, this is a typical recurrence-based job. It could be a nightly feed of your credit card information or a bi-weekly feed of, let's say, a payroll journal, right? So basically, it's scheduled. In terms of pattern, I really like the asynchronous pattern, and that's what we try to kind of push all of our customers to implement. The reason being, in the asynchronous pattern, the systems are decoupled. So let's say, for example, CRM is down or AX is down, it doesn't really matter. The message gets sent and it gets logged in the message queue. And as and when the systems are up, it will start processing. And the other good part is the error handling. So whatever happens with that particular message, let's say you had a sales order, on the line you were missing an item, right? So when you import it through recurring job, it gets logged as an error in the recurring job. So if you compare that with real-time call using OData, so we are not logging, for example, let's say the CRM example I gave, where it's going back to operations to get the price. So let's say a combination of item and dimensions were missing. So all it would come back and tell you is there is no price for this. But as a caller, you need to handle that. You need to say, okay, you need to log it somewhere else, and either a person is looking at it, or in a real-time fashion, the person who is trying to get the price, he needs to call someone and say, hey, this price is missing, can you create it, right? But this particular error is not logged anyway. But there are certain scenarios where you want to really implement real-time. So we'll go through those scenarios where we recommend using real-time pattern. So in terms of what's happening today in general, right, when we talk about integrations. So 5 years ago, we thought everyone will be on cloud by now. Guess what happened? So most of our customers are still on-prem, and as you know, in one of the instances, they are asking for even operations to be on-prem version, pure on-prem version. So what's happening right now and tomorrow is we are seeing that customers are open to move some of their on-prem assets to the cloud. Like, for example, it could be our D365 for operations, CRM. It could be like HR management systems. So slowly they are trying to migrate to the cloud. So we are seeing a hybrid approach here. So they have certain assets in on-prem while they have certain assets on the cloud. So as Microsoft, so what's our landscape, right, to tackle this problem? So we tackle this problem really with Logic Apps and BizTalk. So BizTalk 2016 went GA last year. Logic App also went GA last year. And since then, Logic App has added a lot of set of functionalities. So when we recommend hybrid cloud, in terms of integration, we recommend Logic App plus BizTalk. So we really don't recommend replacing, let's say, Logic Apps with BizTalk or BizTalk with Logic App. We see that both work together better, both better together kind of a scenario. And before you go and recommend to any of your customers, I just want to go through some of the scenarios, right? So when we talk about integration, it's not only D365 for operations. You need to look at the entire big picture, what that customer is doing and what kind of assets they are having, right? So before I go through the scenarios, I quickly want to talk about. So on your left side, all you see is the connectors that we have for Logic Apps and BizTalk, right? So on the right side, we have all the services that light up on Azure, and this is the real value add that the customer is getting. So Logic Apps, as I said, it's an iPaaS solution from Microsoft. So iPaaS is integration platform as services. And so the value the customer is getting by using Microsoft iPaaS is all the things that I have highlighted on the right side. So for example, let's say using Logic Apps, you can get data from, let's say, any source and push it to Azure Data Lake. And once you have data in the data lake, then you can build a stream analytics, you can do Azure IoT, and you can even do ML. So that's the real strength of Azure Logic Apps and all the services that you get on top of this. And if you see, even in our core product, we have implemented some of these. For example, we have cognitive services that Azure provides. So we use it for retail scenarios and also for forecasting. So in terms of what I mentioned around, you need to look at the big picture. So I'll go through a few scenarios here. So we have a customer who has, let's say, 90% of their assets on-prem, and they have a BizTalk implementation. And let's say D365 for operation is their first step towards the cloud. And so based on this diagram, you would think then, oh, I need Logic Apps because both of them work better together. But in reality, 90% of their asset is on-prem, and they have a BizTalk that's working fine. So for this customer, you really don't need a Logic App because BizTalk has a HTTP connector which you could use for any type of integration, whether you want to enqueue, dequeue files, or you want to use any of the OData calls, get, post. So BizTalk can do that. In this scenario, we really don't recommend, or we really don't see a need for Logic Apps because most of their assets are on-prem. Let's say we also had one more customer who has multiple assets on cloud. So they are in process of implementing D365 for operations, and they have their, let's say, HR system, which is, for example, Workday, and they have their expenses, which is Concur. So most of their assets is on cloud. So, and they really don't have BizTalk, and for all the ad hoc requirements, they are creating custom web services, and they're using this to communicate between the system. For this customer, yes, we would recommend Logic Apps. So, for example, they had a requirement where they wanted to get the HR data from Workday's flown through operations. So you could use Logic Apps to get data from Workday and then push it to D365 for operation. And we also see customers where they are really small and this is their first journey towards cloud, and today they don't have a lot of integrations, and so they have a very small integration that they want to do with D365. So in this scenario, we are will shortly release something called as Quartz app. And this is a lightweight app which will let you upload files from our on-prem solution to cloud. So for this customer, he's like, my integration scenario is very limited. I don't want to pay for Logic app because I don't need scalability and all the other benefits that I get from Logic app as of now. So they can go ahead and use Quartz, and they can push the files, NQ, DQ, and all that. Quartz, Paul will walk you through that. Okay. So now you get the big picture in terms of when we would recommend Logic apps and when we would recommend BizTalk. And also one thing I forgot, we also have a connector between Logic apps and BizTalk 2016. So any hybrid scenario, you can use both of them, and there is a connector. So in terms of scenarios, we spoke about at a very high level real-time and asynchronous integration. So here is a scenario where customer has an on-prem scheduler. This scheduler is mainly it's scheduling the maintenance job for a person to go do the maintenance. So before it schedules the maintenance, it wants to know if I have enough raw materials to carry out that maintenance, right? So it's doing a lookup, and it wants, once it checks if the items are available, then it wants to go ahead and schedule. So what do you think the integration option should be here? Is it real-time or asynchronous? Real-time, okay. So we'll kind of go through a high-level decision tree. So what's the business requirement, right? That's the very first question you need to ask. So in this scenario, yes, we want real-time because the scheduler needs to confirm whether that person can go on for maintenance, right? And so the next question you really need to ask is the volume high? So in this scenario, the volume is really small. We are talking about maybe a couple of hundred calls in an hour, right? And what's the frequency here? That's the next question, because based on the frequency, that's when you kind of decide whether it's really like asynchronous pattern or real time. So in this scenario, it is like ad hoc. It could be like 100 calls, couple of hours, or in an hour, or in a day, right? So in this case, OData really works fine, so it can cater to this scenario. So we have one more scenario here where this is a specialty retailer, and they have a PHP-based web solution which takes all the sales orders from like the customer rep or whoever it is, right? And in terms of their business, so since they are specialty retail, so they only sell to certain kind of end customers who they call champions, and then the champions are responsible to sell it to the end customer. So in terms of volume, we really don't see high volume, right? So same, you would go through the decision queue. So yes, as soon as we enter the order, we want it to be shown in operations because we want to go ahead and confirm and ship it as soon as possible. So the volume is small and the frequency is ad hoc, as in when they get a request. So these are kind of two OData pattern which would work fine. And this is an interesting customer. They are coming from AX 2012. And so they have a conveyor belt, and they have boxes going through the conveyor belt. And on the conveyor belt, they have a scanning machine which scans the packing slip, which scans the barcode on the box. And once it scans, it needs to send that information to AX, and AX needs to do a packing slip and then trigger a packing slip, which would be then printed and pasted on these box. So they have a 30-second time window from the time the barcode is scanned and the packing slip is printed. So in AX 2012, they had a SQL table where they inserted as soon as the scanner scanned that box, and they had a batch job which was going through this table and processing any new records. So for the 30-second time limit, they, as you know, in AX 2012 and also for operations, the max recurrence, or the shortest recurrence you can have is 1 minute. So what they did is they had a batch job scheduled at top of a minute, and for every 5 seconds they had a new batch job schedule. So in terms of when they are moving to D365, they really don't have access to any kind of SQL DB. So everything needs to happen either through a real-time call or through a message-based service. So based on this, what do you think the integration pattern should be? Okay. So what we ended up doing is a real-time pattern because of the 30 seconds. But the point to note here is the second bullet over there where the volume is big. So our recommendation is whenever you see a scenario like this where it has to be real-time, that's the critical business need based on all your discussion, and the volume is high. So our recommendation is for you to go through a benchmark process on a sandbox environment. So you can, most of your projects would have a SA, so you can work with the SA to do some kind of benchmarking. If you don't have a SA actively involved, you can do the benchmarking by yourself. Couple of things to note here. When you're doing benchmarking, if it is really a high volume, so we have certain SKUs within the sandbox. So we have T3 and T4, which are high beefier machines. So you could use those SKUs to test. And I don't want to go too much into licensing, but usually if you buy a SKU, you'll have to buy it. If you are on a volume licensing, it is for a year. If you're CSP, then I think it is monthly. So we also have something called as MPSA. So with this agreement, you can request a T4 performance box, let's say for a couple of months. So minimum there is a couple of months. So you can use that box to do performance testing, your UAT, before you go to the production. Hopefully that makes sense. Just keep in mind that if you really want to implement this pattern, performance benchmarking is a must. Okay, the next scenario we have here is, this is actually a mobile insurance company, and they have a sales order processing application which sits on premise, and the order is first stored in the on-prem database before it's pushed to operations. So the volume is really high because they kind of suffice to all the mobile carriers. So volume is really high, and so they want these orders in operation. So what do you think the pattern should be here? Okay. So the pattern here is Of course, they have really high volume of sales orders, so it's asynchronous. So in terms of business requirements, there was no real-time need for them. And in terms of volume, it was huge. It could be somewhere between 100 to 200K a day. And in terms of frequency, they were okay to have a frequency of every 5 minutes. So in there, since they had an on-prem solution, so we used SSIS to extract the data, spin up the orders as files, and then they use a custom service to enqueue those files to operations, and operations then process those files. Okay, this is one more interesting customer. So this customer has a PLM solution, which is the product lifecycle management solution, and they have this on-prem. And so in terms of the data that's available in PLM, they have item definition, BOM, and a few other things. So from a customer standpoint, this is their bread and butter, and they have a huge security requirement that they don't want to open, let's say, for example, a web service to get the data out. They don't want to open it to the public domain. So then how do you solve it, right? So this is the part where we were talking with Azure, different kind of value add services that you get. So we have a couple of options here. So you can use Azure Application Proxy, or you can use the API management. So for this customer, we ended up using Azure API Proxy. So with Azure API Proxy, you typically install a connector on-prem device, and this connector is used between Azure AD and to talk to that web service. And the good part about this is it still honors the single sign-on. So you just go through like a regular authentication. And from a cloud application standpoint, it seems like for that application, this service is on cloud. So that's the kind of experience you get. And later this evening, we have a deep dive session where we talk in detail on Azure Application Proxy and the API management. API management, very high level. It's kind of extending your VPN on the cloud using Mina. Okay, this is one additional scenario that we'll talk later. So this is a pattern where you want to send a file from operations to a bank, right? So again, calling the web services or any service via secure fashion. So Paul will go through that. And these are kind of the high-level patterns that we have gone through with our customers, and hopefully this gives you a sense of how you can break down a real-time integration and asynchronous integration. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Good question. So going through that integration, those three major questions, wouldn't the integration type be also one of the questions? In other words, bidirectional versus unidirectional. And also, having data that you collected those major questions, you guide us what the best practices is for deployment.
Yeah.
Deployment have any impact on the best practice integration is on-prem or with the cloud, which part of the assets are represented?
Yeah, good question. So I think your first question was around bidirectional nature. So the decision tree we put up there is a very high level, and then based on that, you will further probe in terms of what exactly the volume is and the nature of the integration. So both real-time and asynchronous pattern, they both support bidirectional. So they both support CRUD, right? So you can create, read, write, update. So both support that. So where it gets tricky with the bidirectional is you need to again think about what's the volume, right? And with OData, you have certain set of limitations in terms of what you could update or not. But with DIXF, you have you have more flexibility because DIXF, when you queue in a file, for every file, we spin up a thread. And so these files are processed in a parallel fashion. But all your OData, they'll go sequentially based upon what the call you're doing. So with DIXF, it will process the file in a multi-threaded fashion, and it uses SSIS, and it's a bulk insert, so it goes to staging, boom. So in terms of your second question, yes, that kind of leads you back to the first slide, whether you need to decide where your assets are, right? If bulk of them are on-prem, then BizTalk, you would use standard NQ, DQ. And if it is on cloud, then Logic Apps. Paul, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, and to be honest, because this on-prem thing is so new, we don't yet have a customer that's actually on it, so we've never worked with anybody who's, just to be honest.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a BizTalk minimum version number? Do you have an on-prem BizTalk so that we plug in?
I don't.
So we'll take questions at the end, but I'll answer that one. If you can get 2016, get onto 2016 because it's got lots of support for Logic App. So we have a lot of contents to go through. We'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
So, in terms of scenarios, we also, when we talk about integration, we also wanted to talk about data warehousing. So, I'm sure you guys are confused with the two options that are available there. One is entity store, and the other concept we have is bring your own database. So in terms of entity store is used to light up any of your Power BI reports. That's the only scenario where you would use entity store. And in terms of data, what you could push to an entity store, it's an aggregated measure, and you can schedule a recurrence and push this data to the entity store. So quite often the question I get is, oh, it's called entity store. Does that mean that I can push a regular entity, right? So, well, we only let you push aggregated measures, but having said that, you can use a regular entity as a data source in your aggregate measure and push the aggregate measure to the entity store. And the benefit that we are getting with the entity store is direct SQL access from all the Power BI reports. So usually with the very initial versions, you would have seen some of our content packs would take more time to refresh. But I think it's during the August release, we came up with the entity store, and now we are slowly moving all our reports to entity store, which uses direct SQL. And in terms of next concept, it's bring your own database. So this is a scenario where you want traditional integrations where it needs to talk to a SQL server. You need a direct SQL access. So on this, again, we let you push all the entities, and the only database that we support as of today is SQL Azure. So you can create a recurrence job schedule in terms of what entities that you want to push, and once you have the connection string set up, and based on the recurrence, it will start pushing your data to bring your own database. In terms of tips and tricks that we have seen with bring your own database, right now we don't support delete when you're doing an incremental push. So for incremental push to work, you would enable change tracking either on the entity or the primary data source. Once you have this, then you should be able to export data in an incremental fashion. But for some of the customers, what we have seen is they really want to know what data got deleted. So if we talk about incremental push, it will cater to, for example, any new record that is created or any record that got updated. So it will grab those values and push it to bring your own database. But if you delete a record, right now we don't go back and delete record in bring your own database. So the only solution you have is doing a full push. So in some of the instances, you can have a full push once a day, and between the day, you can have incremental push, so that way the data gets flushed out once a day, and you get all your deleted records updated. Having said that, we are looking at including the delete scenario in fall release. And again, that's what we have planned. So if there are any items we can prioritize, we'll see if we can have this for spring release. In terms of bring your own database, the other thing is when you do a full push, it actually deletes all the data and recreates from the scratch. So sometimes what happens is if you have some jobs, integration jobs that is querying the bring your own database, and you have this full push job that's running. So for example, you have a vendor master integration. You're pushing all the vendors from operations to bring your own database, and there are some audit systems that are consuming this data, right? So when you do a full push, let's say the audit system is reading the data, and meanwhile, you are pushing full push. So let's say if you are pushing 100K vendors, it will initially delete all the vendors, bring your own database, and then it will start inserting in a bulk fashion. It could be like 50K at one shot and 50K at the next shot. So when the integration system is reading the data, it might see like, I just have 50K vendors, and it might think the other 50K is missing. So this is something you need to sequence. So think about pushing, like for example, you can push the status of these jobs into bring your own database. So that way you know based on the job ID whether the vendors got recreated completely or partially. So before reading the vendor table in your bring your own database, you can look at the job and make sure that it's a favorable time for your integrations to read. And last thing here is we don't push any security to bring your own database. So you have direct access that sits on your subscription, and you have full access, and we expect you to take care of the security. Okay, we saw the recurrence pattern. In terms of big picture, when we talk about individual scenarios, it may seem like, it's a low volume, so all of them might be a real-time pattern based on the, let's say, customer need. But if you look at this holistically, it could be like, I have like 100 integrations real-time, and they are all hitting at the same interval, right? So in that case, you need to make sure that maybe some of these things, which are not really real-time, you need to start tailoring it to asynchronous options. And by doing that, what you are trying to do is taking care of the performance, right? Asynchronous options are really fast. DX, as you know, it can process files multi-threaded, and there are also some other options. You can do bulk insert and a few other things. Right? And also think about load balancing. What we mean by load balancing is if you're scheduling something in a recurrence fashion, make sure that you're not overlapping on each other if there is no business requirement to do that. And while you do that, think about also all the real-time OData calls that might be kind of stepping on each other. So these are some things that you need to take care of. In terms of OData tips and tricks, what we have seen from our experiences, the first one is post-only set properties. So, for example, if you are creating a sales order, let's say manually, all you need is a sales order ID, which is automatically generated, and customer and few others. And rest of the values are defaulted. But when you're doing an OData call, if you don't use this property, then what would happen is the OData call would assume that you have left all the other values as blank, and then it will start throwing errors that, hey, your address is null, this is null, right? So make sure you use this property so that it can default all the other values. And in some of the patterns with OData, we have seen that there is a need for transactional scope. What we mean by transactional scope is, for example, let's say a header and child kind of data where the sales order header and line both goes in at one shot. If there is an issue with the line, then the header needs to be reverted back. So you can use this batch with single chain set. And so what OData internally does is it puts this call into, it bundles this call as one call and pushes it to operations. And let's say, for example, if operations didn't find an item number, then this call failed, it will roll back the header. And you can use this property to also combine for example, you are creating, let's say, hundreds of records at the same time, and you have a business scenario where even if one of the one of the record fails, you have to undo the entire thing. And from a performance standpoint, you can use this value to make sure that instead of you pushing, like typically what happens is if you don't use this property and you are using OData, each of the insert will go as separate call to operations. If you use this property, all of them are bundled together. And if you use Fiddler, you would see that there is only one batch called to operations. And one thing you might run into this is OData stack, we don't support dynamic arrays. So one of the areas where we have found this is timesheet. So we had enabled timesheet for OData protocol, but we'll soon release a hotfix to block OData because we don't support arrays. So if you run into this scenario, our recommendation is, so one real quick thing, when we talk about dynamic arrays, in this case, in your timesheet, let's say, for example, if you look at the table, you have a column called hours, and behind the hours column, all you're doing is using a dynamic array, which would then split into 7 days in a week. So it's Monday to Sunday kind of a thing. So with each of these values, you can mention, like on Monday I worked 8 hours, Tuesday 7 hours, or whatever it is. So if you run into this scenario with the latest fall release, we have an mobile app to enter the timesheets. So we have a timesheet service, and we have a flat table that accepts all your timesheet, and then it processes these records behind the scenes and creates actual timesheets. So our plan is to build an entity on top of what we have for the mobile services, and you could use this entity to push all your timesheets into that particular table, and the timesheet service then spins up and reads this data and creates the actual timesheet. And the last step here is the header line pattern. So typically, if you're talking about any header and line, you would see that usually the header number sequence is created by operations, and you would want operations to create the number sequence. And so within your C# code, you can still go ahead and call AX classes, operation classes to generate the number sequence and assign it to the header, and then you can assign it to the line, and you can bundle this call so that if anything breaks, it's completely undone from a transactional scope standpoint. And in case if you don't want to call the number sequence, then all you need to make sure is the ordering of the particular entities, whether if it is sales order header, you call the header first, save it, then you call the line and pass on the values, in this case sales order to the line, sales order ID to the line. In terms of tips for recurring job, so clean up all your old message. So if it is anything greater than 30 days, you can clean up the messages, because all these messages, in turn, they are eating up your blob storage. So we are releasing a hotfix soon for you to clean up in an easier fashion. And the next step is around cross-company. So in AX 2012, if you had, let's say, 50 companies and you want to process, let's say, sales order in these 50 companies, typically you had two options. The first option is create 50 batch jobs, like individually in each company, and then have kind of 50 folder structure for each of the company, and then the batch job would run on these folders. And it's a nightmare to maintain all the batch jobs. And the second option you had is you kind of have some reference on the file to mention which company it is, and then from file to get staging, you would read as if it was cross-company. Anyways, it does it. And from staging to target, you would typically override the method and take control, and then you would group by on a company and then change the company and create the data. But with operations, you can schedule one batch job and make it cross-company. And by this way, all your inbound files, when you are queuing up the inbound files, you can mention in your queuing call what companies it goes in, and the DXF will honor that. In terms of export, again, in terms of the company scenario, you might have 50 companies where you want to export sales order and send it to, let's say, bring your own database or a file. So typically, you would have to either schedule a recurrence job in all the 50 companies, or you have to kind of write a wrapper class to export it from all the companies. So one of the things that an entity offers is, if you're creating your own entity, there is a property called as company context. So you can remove the company context, so that means this entity will work across the company. And one thing to note here is when you do that, your entity needs to be a read-only entity, because by default, the nature of an entity is it supports both import and export. But when you change this property, it can be only read-only, because entity by nature, import will be working based on the company. So that's one thing for you to know. And on the recurrence batch setup for import, we also have something called as process message in order. So remember, I walked you through a scenario where the sales orders are getting created for a mobile insurance company, right? In that scenario, let's say a customer bought an insurance which had, let's say, $200 deductible, and they said, yes, I'll go through this option, and later they changed their mind, and they said, okay, now $200 deductible seems high, I want to go for a $50 or $100. So the customer rep went back to that sales order, and he or she updated the sales order and published this file. So let's say we had a recurrence schedule of, let's say, an hour, and within an hour, you have two files. The very first file with the $200 deductible sales order, and then the subsequent message for the same sales order, the updated SKU is a $50 or a $100 deductible. So as you know, when the batch job for DXF kicks in, it creates one particular thread for each of the file. And in this case, what would happen is whichever job, let's say the $50 and the $200 sales order both are getting executed at the same time because of the nature of what DIXF does. And whoever completes, let's say if the $200 got processed after 150, then in AX you have a version of a sales order that is not equal to what you have in your on-prem database. So if you have this requirement on the recurring job, you have something called as process message in order. So what it does is it goes through the timestamp and it sequences all your files based on the timestamp. So first it would process the $200 deductible file, and then subsequently then there would be a $50 deductible sales order which is updated and it will process. So in this case it's processing sequentially, so you would lose the parallel processing, but that's your customer requirement. So whenever you have that requirement, you can use this option. And the last thing I want to talk about here is bundling. So with the AX 2012, you had the bundling option, but with the D365 for operations, we still have the bundling option, but it's just that the config is now in a different place. It's on the entity setup. And so you have various options. You can mention that, okay, when I'm using this particular entity, let's say a sales order, and I can mention whether the rows are, whenever it is about 1,000, I can then say that how many parallel batch jobs I can task I can create. So let's say for 1,000 sales orders, I want to create 3 parallel tasks, so I can mention this. And whenever this recurrence gets scheduled, and if it reads a file, if it is now more than, let's say, 1,000 records, then from staging to target, it will spin up 3 batch tasks, and all of these 3 are executed in parallel. So based on the batch job, you get this parallel processing. So we definitely want you to utilize this. And we have a session tomorrow morning around data management. We'll talk a little bit more on bundling and type of configurations you have compared to AX 2012. So I'm handing over to Paul. Paul will talk about quads and some of the bank scenarios and logic apps.
Okay, thanks, Goku. I'll try to talk really fast. I'll probably just eat 5 minutes into your Q&A time, and then I'll dive into the details later today in the advanced session. We've actually went through this scenario if you came here last year for the tech conference, for the integration session. So that's in there. The main scenario here, why we put this scenario at the end is because we don't want you to get used to this pattern and use it on a often basis, because this is for a non-tabular data format, unstructured data. So all the scenarios Goku just covered is for tabular data, right? Structured data, it's in the table. If you want to get data in and out of X in a structured way, in a table, through an entity, you use DIXF, OData, all the out-of-the-box one, right? This is it's a bank payment file. If you guys have seen or worked with a bank payment file, it's in regular format, right? So it's nothing you can store in a table. Therefore, we have this custom service. Basically, there's a DLL called Shared Service Unit Storage that would actually allow you to save the bank payment file in our blob storage behind the scene. You don't have direct access to the blob storage, but you have access to the blob storage through the DLL. So you can reference that DLL in your X++ code. As a matter of fact, that's the DLL. Anywhere you see a file upload in D365, we use that API. So that way, you can actually store the unstructured data file in a blob storage, stand up a custom service, and then have a custom client that you're running to retrieve the file. Again, this is not something that you should use quite often. We don't want you guys to take this and say, yeah, I have a 2012 existing integration where I take a file from my on-prem system, bring it in, I parse that file, put it in your staging table, and then bring it into the X, right? We don't want you to use this pattern for that, because for that, use DIXF, use the recurring integration job, and all that. I apologize, I'm going through this really fast. I have a series of slides that talks about all the different technologies, BizTalk, Service Bus, QuadX, Logic App, Flow, when to use Flow and when to use Logic App, which we'll cover in details this afternoon, 4:45 in Tahoma number 5. Before I end and start the Q&A, I want to dive into a real quick, just give you guys a sneak peek. I know it's the last session of the day, so you guys might go for a drink instead of come to our sessions, but just to get a little promo out there. No worries. Okay, so over here, so the thing I want to demo here is, how many of you guys have used recurring integration jobs in production? Awesome. What do you use as the client to interact with the recurring job? How many of you guys use the sample app we put out in GitHub? How many of you use QuadX or no QuadX? Yes. Good, good. For those of you who had your hand up, who's using the DIXF sample app, come talk to us after the session. So this one, how many of you have used Logic App in production? Awesome. So this one, I'm just going to demo real quick. Essentially a Logic App demo where we use, for those of you who already use Logic App, I don't know how many Logic Apps you have, right? So if you have more than one recurring job, you might end up scheduling more than one recurring Logic Apps flows to handle a recurring job. Also, for those of you who use the GitHub sample app or Quads for that matter, for things like guaranteed delivery, error handling, and real-time alerts, right? So if a job fails to upload or if X is not even up and running, how do you get alert, right? How do you get your admin to come in to say, hey, this file didn't get uploaded? Like that real-time alert, how do you get that? You can actually build that into a Logic App flow, right? So I'm going to show you guys real quick the flow that we have. Again, this is my favorite demo form. This is the fleet management customer form. This is nothing here. In order to do my demo, I'm just going to show, I'm going to start the demo and I'm going to start talking. I have a fleet management customer file. I'm going to drop this file in here. And just for fun, I'm going to drop another customer group file in there. I'm going to drop a zip file in there. Oops. So this simulates somebody is dropping, this is OneDrive for Business, right? This simulates somebody drops a file in an on-premise folder and OneDrive for Business, sync it up to the cloud, and triggers a Logic App. The beautiful thing about a Logic App is it executes in parallel, right? So, I'm at the outbound flow. So I'm going to leave my outbound flow and go to my inbound flow. Okay, that didn't help. There we go. Inbound flow. I think I was too slow. If you look at the timestamp, March 14. So the 3 file I just dropped actually already gone into X. And if I go to my fleet management customer, so it's already got imported. I was too slow for my Logic app. If you want to see more how it works, I can show you guys the actual Logic app. And this is one Logic app flow you can use for all your recurring integrations. It doesn't matter how many projects you have. This is all parameterized. It's real-time alerts. If I purposely actually trying to getting a file that actually would trigger the Logic app to fail, which it would actually send me an email. I'm trying to log into the my mail, Outlook. For every single step, we have real-time email alerts. For every single file we queued up, we get the status. If the status says fail, we send you an email alerts. Anyways, we'll get into the details of this and how you can take ARM templates that we're going to give it to you guys, and you guys can deploy within a couple of seconds. You'll end up exactly the same flow in your subscription. And you get real-time alerts. You get guaranteed delivery. So remember, there's 2 more files I actually added, right? A customer group file and a zip file, which I did not have a recurring integration job for. For those 2, I actually get email alerts to say, hey, you got a error. Come take a look, right? And you can, obviously, since we're on Logic app, you can hook up cool things like Twilio, send yourself a text when a job fails and all that. So anyways, we'll get into that this afternoon. A lot more Azure stuff this afternoon, so highly encourage you to come. Again, 4:45, Tacoma number 5, Q&A. We still have 15 minutes for Q&A. We still have 15 minutes for Q&A, or 10 minutes. Go ahead, man. Yeah.
So that's correct. So we only let you export.
Repeat the question.
Sorry. So the question is, in AX 2012, you could read from a SQL DB, do a ODBC connection, and do read, and you could also export data to an external DB. So with D365, we only give you option to push data to bring your own database. In terms of imports, we don't intend to provide a direct SQL connection. It's based on the messaging service. So we don't intend to provide a direct SQL access.
No.
Yeah.
How do you use that with logic apps?
Can you repeat?
Yeah, sure. The options for the OData post only set properties, how do we use that with logic apps? If I'm using the data entity within logic app, how can I use that?
I guess with automation for Logic app, we actually have a connector that sits on top of the OData endpoints, right? And we just take care of that behind the scene. So if you pick an entity, you list all the properties you need to set on that entity, right? You just set them, and then when we actually call into the OData endpoints behind the scene, we take care of that. We use that property ourselves. You don't have to worry about that property when you use Logic app connector. Yeah.
The example I was trying is to push a sales order, and I had to provide the sales order ID, for example. I was going to use logic app rather than I wanted to be so I wasn't sure.
Yeah, so anything that shows up on the Logic app connector, you'll need to fill in. If you want something to be set, like for the sales header and line thing, you most likely you need to have the header set first before you can call the line. Or you just need to set the number sequence to be manual. And you pass that in. It's the same, yeah.
Any plans to publish Swagger data for the custom services so you can use those in Logic apps and Flow?
The good news is Swagger is nice. I've definitely talked to the PM who's in charge to say, hey man, add Swagger, light up beautifully on Logic app. But we're going to talk a bit more this afternoon. We actually just shipped last week So the out-of-the-box D365 for Operations connector on Logic App or on Flow, before it can only do CRUD. Right? You can do create, delete, update, and get read. We actually, last week, we've just added an action. If you go on Logic App today or Flow today, you'll see an action called execute. And what that does is, when you pick execute and when you drop that, drop down list, it's actually going to auto discover all the custom services that you have deployed. It doesn't give you Swagger, but we behind the scene we discover what the parameters are and we put the
and have
definition
those logic
there.
within D365.
Yeah, so you are able to call. Correct. Yeah. Yes. Anything that you deploy as a custom service is available through Logic App. You can execute. It's basically anything you define as OData action, we can call it. Yeah.
Can you clarify that the OData endpoint is single-threaded?
What do you mean by that?
If we were to flood the OData endpoint with multiple requests, they're processed sequentially? Or how many will it serve at one time, I guess?
Yeah, because we're a web app, right? All the LS service is no longer an LS service, right? It's run as a web app on IIS. So you can send web requests to us simultaneously. We'll just handle them. In that service tier, we can indefinitely scale out that service tier. So in terms of handling concurrent HTTP requests, we can scale out indefinitely. But then ultimately, the bottleneck is the database, because you're hitting the single database, right? So when you're
And the OData framework.
right, and there's some built-in limitations there, but in terms of how much traffic can you get through, ultimately it's your size of your database.
And you can bundle.
Thank you. Two quick questions for you. We're currently on AX 2012 R3. We're a manufacturing operation. We have a lot of side systems that at this point require file exchanges. Some of them are old legacy systems that aren't going away anytime soon. And can you explain a little bit more about the Azure Blob Storage and how that works when we have to feed these side systems those file exchanges, number one. And then number two, similar, I mentioned manufacturing, we have hundreds of printers for labels, pick lists, such that have to be, that have jobs sent to them based on different criteria of whatever's going on in the process at that time. How does something like that work when you have the cloud and you have all these line printers sitting out on different lines of operations within manufacturing?
Yeah, I'll answer the first question. Go ahead. If you have.
So in terms of blob storage, so what you do with D365 is the blob storage you can use for every recurring job. You have a GUID, and against that GUID, you would enqueue all your files, and the recurring job based on the GUID, it knows what blob storage is behind, and it will process the messages based on your enqueue sequence if you have processed the message.
I would actually ask a follow-up question to you is what type of data is in the file? If it's like we talk about, right? If it's unstructured data, like a payment file or some kind of label, right? Then the custom solution, we briefly touched on it. I apologize. If you want the details, we actually covered that in details from last year's tech conference session that we did. But for anything that's structured, right? Like sales order, vendor, customer, you want to integrate, or customer, or product definition bomb, or the inventory journal, anything that we have out of the box that we have entity support for, don't go to that solution. That's why we kind of purposely put it at the end. It's only for unstructured data.
Well,
right?
There are legacy systems, though, that don't have the ability to consume services. So they have to have a file to pull in, if you will, for operation. But what I'm seeing, though, is dealt mainly with services. So you take that blob storage, use a service then that is consumed by the caller. In this case, these are systems that don't have the ability to do that service call. So what happens in that event when your blob storage is on Azure, you have these on-prem legacy systems?
So I guess one thing we failed to call is, because we assume, have you worked with a recurring integration job?
No.
Yeah, okay. I apologize. So this session assumes a lot of basic knowledge. That's why, because we're from the solution architecture team, so we're sharing our implementation kind of experience we assume a certain level of knowledge coming to the session. So, but I can definitely cover really quickly. We have a recurring integration job which works when we talk about async. It works on a file. So right, and we have 4 simple APIs for you to call to enqueue the file, get get status of an enqueued job, dequeue the file in case of an export, and acknowledge the downloading of the file, right? So if your legacy system can put out a file and that's all it can do, which is fine, then you have 2 options there. You can either host a on-premise daemon process, or it could be a little simple console app that monitors a folder, right? Your legacy application drops a file there. The console app, whatever service detects there's a file in the folder, and then call those 4 APIs to enqueue the file. Or we'll go through the logic app scenario where you don't have to run anything on-prem, right? The logic app was going to monitor the folder you have on-premise. All the legacy app does is drop the file on-premise. Then the logic app's going to suck it up. The logic app's going to queue it up into X7, and then it'll get taken care of.
So we are here for 5 more minutes after the session, so you can come to
Yeah.
Does D365 offer, for DXF jobs, does it offer dependency setup? So like, let's say you have job A and job B, and job A fails, but job B is dependent on A. Can you set up a dependency that will put job B on hold until job A is fully executed?
Yeah. So in terms of DIXF, now it's based on the entities. So you can create a data project, and within the context of data project, there is an entity sequence. And within the entity sequence, you can mention the execution level and what happens if a particular level fails. Does it roll back the entire execution unit or that particular level? So we have a session tomorrow. We are talking in detail on entity sequence. Data management session, you can come. Thanks all.
Thank you.